You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Our guest on this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour is Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson. Our regular listeners know that Dr. Johnson appears as a guest on the show from time to time. Dr. Johnson is a Russian Orthodox priest. He is also a university professor and a scholar par excellence, probably the foremost authority on all things Russian here in the United States. But today we're not going to talk about Russia per se. We're going to talk about Romania. At the time, Romania was one of the Soviet satellite states. Basically, what we're going to talk about is The Anti-Humans, which is a book that was reviewed by Dr. Johnson, and then he put out academic papers under the same title. And just unbelievable torture that was administered by the communist Romanian government. Torture that Dr. Johnson described, he says the only way you can describe it is to say that in some ways it was ceremonial, homosexual acts, fecal matter, just undescribable, unbelievable tortures that they put these people through, thinking that they would tear them down and rebuild them in the communist image, thinking that they would rebuild these people as communist loyalists rather than being Christians or nationalists and so forth. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, and it's going to be a very interesting conversation. You're going to want to stay tuned for it. Tell us why you chose the title of Anti-Humans.
Because that's the title of the book. Baku's book is called The Anti-Humans, Student Re-Education in Romanian Prisons. And specifically, it's the Pitești prison. There are many of them. Misla, Suceava, Ilava, Gerla, there are many of them. There was a full gulag system in Romania. But for some reason, Pitești was the site of these psychological tests. So The Anti-Humans is the name of the book. And this actually started as a review of the book, but of course it expanded beyond that. So it was one of the victims that chose that name.
So was the victim referring to themselves as having been made into an anti-human, or they were referring to their torturers as anti-humans?
Both.
Okay.
And both makes a lot of sense. You know, torture, like slavery, like any kind of subjection, affects both parties. As Hegel always, very famously said about the master-slave relation, yeah, the slave is subject to the master, but the master is also dependent on the slave's labor. It's not, he isn't a free man either. The people who did this horrible stuff, they either were messed up to begin with, or were forced to do this and then got used to it over time. The experiments in the United States, Milgram experiment, which I've read about extensively, about how authority figures can convince you to really inflict pain if it's for a good cause, is pretty extensive. Of course, I'm citing many other books on this topic, usually from Romanian, but there's a few in English. They would bring one half of the prisoners and promise them freedom or something if they would do these things to the other half.
So was it kind of like a Hunger Games scenario, or?
It wasn't that chaotic. That happened once in a while. This was a highly regimented prison, and there was a very specific theory of psychology that was being manifest there. These were real experiments. It may have got out of hand by the early 50s. Too many people were starting to notice this. There was some dissent. And so the Hunger Games, I've seen the movie, I've seen the first one anyway. It wasn't that chaotic. It wasn't for entertainment purposes. It really was to destroy any love of family, of nation, and of the church, and to become totally dependent on the Communist Party.
So I know you've read 1984.
In high school, yeah.
Okay, and so you remember the very end of that book, right before they shot Winston Smith in the back of the head. The last words that he uttered as he was sitting there in the the Ministry of Re-Education was, "I love Big Brother."
Yeah.
What was it? Was it that kind of Ministry of Re-Education thing, only more in tune to torture than psychology?
Torture can be psychological. The physical element of this stuff was really subject to the psychological element of it. It's been a while since I read 1984. I read it in high school. I read it in college.
But the last couple chapters of that book are Winston Smith and the re-education ministry.
Yes. After the war, I could never tell if he's being ironic, if he's saying this because he believes it, or if he says it because he has no other choice. Mm-hmm. There are three options there.
See, of course, everybody can interpret the book differently. I thought he had finally come to the point, where he really did love Big Brother. And, of course, the goal was to execute him all along, but they couldn't just execute him. They had to torture him and manipulate him and break him down and rebuild him into their own image before they would give him the mercy of execution.
Yeah.
That's just the way I interpret it. Other people can interpret it differently.
Well, no, it's a very psychological book. Orwell was thinking of the Soviet Union, of course. That was a model that he used. But these people were, I guess, at some point meant to be released or used to train other ones. I mean, this was supposed to be an experiment. Now, of course, I also say in this paper that it degenerated from an experiment into a Talmudic ritual because of the sexual nature of these tortures, especially the fecal nature, which screams Talmud. Seems to almost be an obsession there. That degenerated into really almost a Judaic ritual, because as you read in my paper, this is not part of the anti-humans, but the end of my paper, I list this small army controlling communist Romania at the time, including the entire prison system and the propaganda ministry, which is very Jewish. So I refuse to believe that there's no connection here. There is. So I guess ultimately, at some level, these people were meant to be released and a new order created, or at the very least, they were seeing what would happen with these guys, kill them, or if they'll probably die on their own, and then they'd adjust it to use on the broader population.
Was Romania kind of an experiment, and the Soviets figured, we'll try this in Romania, and if it works, we'll bring it to the broader, to the whole rest of the Soviet Union? Or was it one of those situations where the people in Romania were just crazy and went way beyond anything the Soviets could have ever imagined?
After 1945, you had this hatred, and the Romanian Iron Guard and the government of General Antonescu were very, very nationalist and very ideological and firm in their organization, which you did not see in places like Spain or Hungary. So they had a much firmer National Socialist government under Antonescu, and so it created an equally firm reaction. And this is another reason I say that this is a Talmudic ritual, because it was a form of revenge. I think that's the cause, and that's the reason, not to mention reaction to the Legion and Antonescu.
I know you wrote a lot about different types of sexual torture, torture with human feces. I guess just break all those down for us.
Well, I'm going to be very, very brief about it. I mean, the reason I wrote this paper is so other people don't have to read the book, because it's a very, very difficult book to read. The very general point was to associate the things of the church, whether it be icons or services or prayers or chants or anything like that, with having to eat this stuff, or being beaten, or only being allowed to lay down in one position and never moving, something like that. The point being that whenever they saw a cross, they would have a relapse. It would be like PTSD, and they could never possibly pray ever again. That really was the core of it. It struck me that some of the anal and fecal tortures that they use now today are mainstream pornography, especially among the fags. So what was considered torture, the worst kind of torture humanly imaginable today, people are paying people are paying for today. Also reinforcing the entire Talmudic narrative of the whole thing. Let me quote Baku here for you, and this will summarize the whole thing. This is from chapter 6. This is really a programmatic statement. Everything of the past which could offer any kind of refuge was to be muddied and denigrated. This included heroes of history and the folklore of Christian inspiration. Then, to be given special attention was the destruction of love for family, in order to completely isolate the victim in his own misery, bereft of religion, love of country, family. This would break the chain that links together a community of national thought and gives meaning to a national struggle. When the individual is thus cut off from his history, faith, and family, the ultimate step in re-educating him was to destroy his existence as a personality. This to the victim was to prove the most painful step and was called his unmasking. So unmasking, to tear away all of these, what the communists would consider these negative influences, they used the most vile methods. They needed, what does a human being recoil from the most? Lack of sleep, waste products, homosexual behavior, beatings. Just think of the worst tortures imaginable. They really were creative about it. They had a backpack about 40 pounds worth of stuff in it, and they had to lean up against their head up against the prison wall with their left leg up, and they couldn't move. Now you do that for even a couple of minutes, and you start getting they had to do this for hours. The pain was unimaginable, but what they would put them through otherwise was far worse. And then over time, when these guys would relent, now you know the concept of Stockholm Syndrome, when these guys would relent, this tremendous wave of relief would flow over them. And then this is one of the reasons that they would get this kind of almost loyalty. Now, it didn't work in their case, and there was very little relief. There was no Stockholm Syndrome here, but it is to create total and complete dependency. And by dependency, I mean the idea that there's no point in resisting what is, inevitable. Marxism, communism, materialism, this is the wave of the future. Anything that goes against that, we will have you associate that with sickness and the most horrible things you can imagine. And the experiment really was, if not to release these guys afterwards, which I don't think was the case, the more I think about it, it has more to do with seeing how people react, and then they organize public policy accordingly. Now that connection has not been made. It wasn't done that way, and the Jewish government didn't last very long in Romania. That was the point of it. That was the nature of it.
So was it a situation where the torture and the methodology that they were using was not breaking people? In other words, if this hammer isn't big enough to smash the rock, we'll use a bigger hammer. And then when that one didn't work, they used a bigger hammer, and then they used a bigger hammer, and they used a bigger hammer. Or was it just one of these situations where these men were just that sadistic to begin with, and this was a graduated program?
As I mentioned before, with the Milgram experiments and other experiments in America, it doesn't take long to be desensitized to inflicting pain, especially if you're given rewards for it, especially if you're convinced it's for a good cause, that you're in line with the authorities and these people are evil or whatever it is. Oftentimes it was people who were other prisoners who were promised all kinds of privileges if they were to go and do it. And they were some of the worst. They really wanted to get out of there. And because they couldn't, the thing is, they had no control, and part of the point of torture is that they have no control over the world around them. They have no control over their own bodies. So when they were given a tiny modicum of control by beating another prisoner, they really lost it and really went crazy.
Well, all you have to do is look at the training of quote-unquote law enforcement in the United States today. Basically it's a psychological manipulation system where the soon-to-be police officer is entirely demasculated, and then he's allowed to get little pieces of his manhood back by going out into the community and taking it away from others. I know that's not the subject that we were going to discuss today, but that's exactly what comes to mind as you talk.
Well, even think of like Full Metal Jacket, the movie, the first half with the Paris Island boot camp scene. Kubrick captures it very well. The point of boot camp is to completely destroy the old man, the kid who wanders into Paris Island, cut down, and a new man put in its place. And the way to do that is through, essentially shock and awe, constant screaming, endless work. But there is a certain reward system to it, though. Depersonalization, and even to some extent regression. I add a lot of the psychological articles on torture and what it's really supposed to do. It has nothing to do with information. This isn't about getting information from people. It's about remaking people. Every definition of torture that I've come across in writing this thing, it's about, there's a guy, very famous psychologist who wrote Malignant Self-Love, in 2001, and here's how he defines it. He says, torture is about reprogramming the victim to succumb to an alternative exegesis of the world proffered by the abuser. It's an act of deep, indelible, traumatic indoctrination. The abused also swallows whole and assimilates the torturer's negative view of him, and often, as a result, is rendered suicidal, self-destructive, or self-defeating. And it's no accident that, a few of these guys were able to kill themselves. Now, they didn't really have enough supplies to kill themselves. They didn't have anything in their cells or anything like that. But a few of them did. Father Roman Braga, who was a victim, who died a few years ago, he was at the monastery in Michigan for many, many years. You go find his interview on YouTube. He speaks good English. And in his case, he says, I came out with a stronger faith than ever before. It didn't work, in other words. It failed on him. I don't associate this stuff with what happened there. And the reason is, of course, is that Marxists don't understand the spirit. They think everything is just cause and effect. How could it not be that after 2 years under that kind of torture, you don't associate one with the other? Forgetting that it's not just physical cause and effect. There's also a soul, and that soul is free, that soul has grace, and that soul can overcome. Something that Marxists or liberals, they're very similar. They're both materialists and everything else. They can't comprehend that. They don't understand it when these policies fail, because all they know is behaviorist psychology.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. But the need to reprogram people. I mean, wouldn't it be easier just to kill off the dissidents and re-educate their children? I mean, why the manipulative need to re-educate the masses?
Because the whole foundation of revolution, from the French Revolution or even the British Revolution before that, it's not just to change one ruling class into another. It's about rebuilding humanity. There's a Gnostic, Kabbalistic element here that's always been. Karl Marx's early poetry was all on the apocalypse, the end of the world that he was going to bring, even as a teenager. Very, very lurid descriptions of what the end would look like. It just goes back to alchemy in Renaissance Florence. It's about creating new men. It's about altering the very, as I say, default settings of the brain. That's what revolution meant to them. It's not just a clumsy state. I mean, they wanted internal methods of resistance had to be broken down, just like external methods. And again, it's not as simple as killing them all off. I mean, that's even Stalin couldn't do that. Mao couldn't do that. They do have limited resources, and they do have the Soviets may have had a problem with that. They can't just slaughter half the population and say, okay, we'll take care of the kids now. It doesn't work that way. But they're talking about creating a new human being, a second creation better than the first, which is classic Gnostic thinking. That's what revolution is always, not just Marxism, but revolution has always been about that in the modern world.
It's hard to comprehend evil. I mean, basically to wrap your head around this, not just what happened, but also the motivations behind it. It's like you're trying to wrap your head around evil itself, and that's a hard thing to do. I mean, to think that evil can exist on that level.
Yeah, we talk about politics, and we talk to some normies on the outside. We talk about the big banking clans and those who have this kind of the Rockefellers and media elites. They have power that we can't comprehend. We have no idea what it would be like to be able to rule a whole population that way. And so, because they live that way, some of them were raised that way. They don't see the world the same way we do. They don't see anything the same way we do. That kind of power, that kind of wealth, those kind of resources distorts their very perception. That's really the way to comprehend it. So a normal person reading this, this couldn't possibly have happened. These couldn't be normal people. We're not talking about the prison guards here. We're talking about this, list of Jewish Communist Party officials that were given complete ownership and power over an entire country to do with as they pleased. And that power we can't comprehend. So we can't comprehend the evil because we can't comprehend what kind of power that is. And they manifested it by rendering these people. Remember, the people who were in these prisons were all nationalists. They were all legionnaires. They were followers of Codreanu and the Iron Guard. And, they were their enemies. They were going to create a state of utter helplessness and powerlessness, almost as a symbol of what Marxism was going to do to the Gentile populations. And the minute Anna Pauker, who was the head of the party, or the unofficial head of the party in Romania, was overthrown, the experiments ended. Now, I don't want to say it hasn't been done elsewhere. There are Soviet gulags who did this, even later under Khrushchev, not with this level of systemization. I mean, this is incredible. And it went on for a relatively short time. Remember, the revolution had just occurred. The Red Army had imposed this government on Romania, and their fervor, their anger, their hatred towards Gentiles was at a fever pitch. So there's a lot of elements that go into this. And in many ways, again, we were not born and raised in that Talmudic mentality where we're the only ones who have souls. But if we were, we would be very different people. And so it's very hard to wrap our heads around it because the relation, the nature of this kind of power, the ideology, the mentality, what it would be like to have the power that a Rockefeller has. I don't even know what that would be like. Right. We can't comprehend it. We don't have a vocabulary for it.
So how long ago was it when you read The Anti-Humans? I mean, when did all this reading and then your writing of the review, when did that take place?
I read it for the first time about 10 years ago, and then just this year, more recently. I don't even remember. I think one of my friends from Romania mentioned it to me, or George Calciu or someone like that who I knew. I knew one of the victims personally. I didn't know that he was a victim at the time, who died recently. And he mentioned that, and then so I said, I'm going to reread this thing, which was a big mistake. But then I said, you know what? I want to write something on it. I want to give an explanation for it so that other people don't have to read it.
So why was it a mistake to read it?
Because I'm a normal human being. And to read about, it's like I couldn't read, books about child molestation or incest. There's only so far you can go before your body just revolts. You just can't, it's revolting to the point where it's unpleasant. We know what happens, but, it's like watching a video of someone torturing a kitten. It's unpleasant to watch.
Right.
So that's why it was a mistake. It's very bad. I couldn't read, Why Johnny Can't Come Home. Some of the stuff, Johnny Gosh and then the early, the snuff gangs, agent Ted Gunderson, who was an old friend of mine. His analysis of something I can't read. As soon as I became a father, I couldn't read any of this stuff. Because you put your own kids in that position. So I'll take your word for it, Ted. It's bad. But at least the victims were able to talk about it. And in fact, they hired one of the documentaries online. They hired an artist under their direction, explained some of the methods, and he put them on canvas. And they said, that's pretty much it. And it's in Romania now. It's toured much of the world. It's probably online. It's a series of the different things they did. Some of it very lurid homosexual stuff and all kinds of just the nastiest things you can imagine these guys doing to one another, being forced to do to one another. And almost that way, it's almost an externalization of what happened. There is no such thing as repressed memories. That's a myth. The American Psychological Association, they've condemned this. The literature in the field says it doesn't exist. And this is proof of it. If there's any group of people who had motive to repress memories, it would be these guys. And even if it did exist, how would you know that the memory then you extract later on is pristine? Why hasn't it changed? How do you know it hasn't changed over time? as it's laid in cold storage. It's myth. The memory doesn't work that way. This was an early experiment in trauma bonding, and to see how far the Gentile mind can be tortured, and what they could do for the rest of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. There were mirror versions of this in the gulags, but on a very local scale and not systematic.
So was there a particular mastermind or particular masterminds who were behind this, or were there just a whole bunch of people across the country doing this in various places and not so much a centralized, mastermind?
Anna Pauker, whose real name was Hannah Robinson, was really the overseer of it all. She was, they called her Stalin in a skirt. She was the head of the party. The director of prisons, directly under her, that would oversee this, was Joseph Kohler. Again, not a Romanian name. The head of the secret police at the time was Sigi Beiner. At the time, also the head of the security police was Alexandru Nikolsky, whose real name was Grunberg. Lev Eugenstein was the head of propaganda for the party, and so he would be in charge of covering it up. And another one, Dilgiru Mahai, colonel in Romanian state security, was a deputy inspector of all communist prisons in Romania, including this one. And then in the 1980s, he immigrated to Israel, and he got away with it all. A lot of these guys ended up immigrating to Israel. I mentioned in the paper that Anna Pauker, one of the reasons she was purged later was that, Stalin and the Warsaw Pact supported the foundation of Israel. The problem was a lot of Jews in these countries wanted to emigrate to Israel. Well, because the party was so heavily Jewish, that means they'd be losing their main people. So all of a sudden, Stalin said, no, we can't permit this. There was one dissenter, and that was Anna Pauker, who was alone in authorizing large-scale Jewish migration from Eastern Europe to Israel. So as she's torturing Romanian nationalists at home, she's promoting it in Jewish nationalism in the Middle East. So this was the brief list of at least the bureaucrats who oversaw the project. And so clearly you have it's a simke, it's a mitzvah. Certainly it's an ethnic experiment. I've not been able to find any, practicing psychologists who were taking notes or anything like that. And I should mention that Pauker, she was purged, but she wasn't killed. She died of cancer in 1960. They just retired her, So when you go through the list of these...
But when you say she died of cancer, that they retired her, do you think that she was given cancer so that she could be retired, or do you think that was just a naturally occurring...
This was years later. I mean, she had been out of politics for a long time in 1960. But who knows? And that was the thing. I mean, there was no...
people don't realize that back in the Soviet Union, they had a way of, giving people cancer or, inducing heart disease or whatever, and, bringing about the demise of people by what seemed to be natural causes.
Sure. The CIA did the same kind of thing. The advantage that the Soviets had is they had a gulag population to experiment on. The U.S. didn't really have that advantage. Remember, Stalin was the first to recognize Israel. He was a Zionist. He said so. The only problem was that the emigration became an issue because how these were such Jewish states, such Jewish governments, they couldn't go to Israel. So they had to stop that, and then that created a schism between Marxism and Zionism. Plus, the U.S. was able to give more money than the Soviets could. I just published a paper on that. I just published a broadcast on Stalin's firm support for Zionism in the state of Israel, and I republished a speech of his UN representative, Gromyko, who gave this whole long thing with the Holocaust and everything else, putting to rest this crap that he was this anti-Semite or nationalist. He was nothing of the kind. But Pauker was such a nationalist, a Jewish nationalist, that despite all her so-called internationalism, she was all about building Jewish nationalism in the Middle East. And it may well be because a lot of these guys had to have somewhere to go. She knew that this wasn't going to last forever. That, in fact, what she was doing was irrational. So and a lot of these guys did run off to Israel and died there in peace.
Extra, extra! extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
So you said that they really didn't break a lot of people with these torture techniques. But what happened to them? I mean, how did these people wind up at the end of this? Did they wind up stronger and more resolved in their faith and their nationalism and so forth? Or
Well, one of these guys I've met, Father George Calciu, who was pastor of Holy Cross Romanian Orthodox Church in Alexandria, Virginia. Father Roman Braga, who I mentioned, who was at the monastery in Michigan. A lot of them, of course, emigrated to this country. They went through the same kind of crap, and they see now there's certain things. Father George said whenever he gets pulled over by a policeman, he gets flashbacks, like in his car if he's speeding or something like that. When he sees the uniform, he says he gets it. He gets a panic attack sometimes. But that's all. Roman Braga says that he, a famous quote that I read when his interview in English, he said, when someone hurts you a little, you carry that with you forever. When someone hurts you like this, you forgive, because you got no choice. And forgiving was a way that they released a lot of this pain, especially when they saw Ceausescu dead, the revolution overthrowing the government and the security police and all that. That was and there is a state organization, although I'm suspicious of them, the Institute for the Investigation of Communist Crimes in the Memory of Romanian Exile. And they're trying, they have file number 35 is all their testimony against these guys. And they've done, very little to bring them to justice. It's being done on purpose. Someone's being protected. But so they see the victory. They see that they were vindicated. So for those two guys, I'm sure they have scars that only they know about. They've said that many committed suicide, and they lost track of the others who were released. I may have to dig deeper into finding out what happened to these guys, or if I can even find that out. But at least I know of two, both of them became fairly well known in this country, and their interviews are on YouTube. I'm sure you'll have their names in the description. You could check it out. And they're both very good writers too. So they explain this. This is central forgiveness and what pain does to you. And it's not necessarily a terrible thing. It's awful at the time, but when it's over, you don't take anything for granted anymore. These men, Father Roman says that he was a better man. He was a stronger man. He was happier because he's been through hell. So nothing really bad can happen to him. I got cancer. So what? I've been in the Pitești prison. But I don't think that that's necessarily the case for everybody.
we've talked about a lot of men who were tortured. Were they torturing women as well, or just men?
No, women weren't tortured.
And why not?
Because they're women.
Okay, but why make the distinction? In other words, why make the choice not to torture the women? There had to be a reason.
Well, in the Soviet Union, nuns and went to their deaths in huge numbers. For the same reason that women in America get, maybe 30% of the jail time that a man does for the exact same crime under the exact same circumstance. It's just easier to torture men than women. I don't know if the head of the party was a woman, if that was relevant to it or not. There may have been female sections of the other prisons I don't know about. It's conceivable. But in Pitești, it was all men. But if you remember, in the Al Ghraib Iraqi prison, the gender thing was used, so they had American female soldiers hurting Arabic males, which, humiliated them, especially from a culture like that. They didn't do that here.
So a lot of times some of the crude things that took place, be it in the Nazi camps or in the Soviet camps and so forth, tended to make their way to the quote-unquote democratic countries, including our own, in more benign forms or in less barbaric forms. So how did some of these tortures in Romania and some of these interrogation techniques and so forth, how did they translate, say, to the United States or to Great Britain in the more benign form? Or did they not?
Well, you see it. Well, if you read E. Michael Jones, and he describes, and authors like that, the various sexual practices that were introduced during the sexual revolution and continue to be introduced by the Jewish pornography firms in this country, which are all, blue chip stocks. The stuff that we describe here, now maybe not the tearing of muscles and stuff like that, but the sexual tortures here now are, as far as I can tell, not that I know anything, but this is mainstream. This is male homosexual stuff. In Jones's books, can't think the Romanian guy who just died. He was part of the reprogramming homosexuals to become heterosexuals. He was out in San Francisco. I can't think of his name off the top of my head. He had a Romanian name. His works describing a lot of this stuff. I'm reading the sexual tortures in this book, and I'm saying, my God, this sounds like, the Gay Pride Parade on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. They just translated it into something, liberatory, something sexual. This is what we do, and it's wonderful. And over time, it was accepted as such. So it's the same experiment, just the West does it better. They don't have someone forcing you to do it. They convince you that this is the thing to do. Liberal torture, psychological torture, is far better than the communist version, because you don't have to be behind bars for it. You just have to be raised, go to public schools, go to American university. You'll come out saying that this is all okay. Hitler was the only bad guy in the war, and what homosexuals do is perfectly acceptable, and it's equal to a marriage that produces kids. And the paintings that I saw that this young guy did, I guarantee you could find that stuff online tomorrow on mainstream porn sites. They just convinced Americans that this is normal, that this is what sexuality is. It didn't take very long. Once you take the genie out of the bottle, the trajectory is already planned out. This is something that Jones spends a lot of time on in book after book, especially in Libido Dominandi. Once it starts, once you release the male sexual drive from its traditional shackles, you never know what it's going to do. It's going to just degenerate. It's hard to put that the genie back in. And so what was considered torture then is normal consensual practice today. I guess the only difference would be that there wouldn't the physical pain, the tearing of muscles and the sleeping in one position, that kind of thing. But the obsession with urine and fecal matter and stuff like that's everywhere among the fags. And it's something that's unpleasant to think about, but our people have to be remembered. This is why we're opposed to them, because of this is what they do. This is part of their whole identity. They think this is sexuality. They think this is equal to when I produce 2 children with my wife. They think it's the same. That's why we're opposed to these people. So the West, private capital, did better in promoting this agenda than Pitesh. One was crude and forced. The other one was hip and cool. And it's shocking that it didn't take very long to do. But once that genie gets out of the bottle, you never know what's going to happen.
Was this a very random, in other words, let's just unleash this powerful whatever and see what kind of damage it can cause, kind of like creating a tornado and setting it loose? Or was this a very calculated weaponization, shall we say, of sodomy, and it's very targeted and it's very distinct in its, in its approach and in its mythology and in what it's intended to do?
Well, nothing is random in our society. Everything is planned. Everything is laid out. And if it isn't, the press will just cover it over anyway. Again, E. Michael Jones spends about 5,000 pages total expressing and explaining the early ideology and mentality behind the sexual revolution after the Second World War, what its purpose was. In the crudest sense, because the male sexual drive is probably the most powerful force in the world, whoever can control that, if you could bottle that, you'll be a world dictator. And that's exactly what the sexual revolution was about. I'll never understand, liberals who think that strip clubs are okay. You think it's okay to deliberately inflame a young man's sex drive? and send them out to the population? Are you retarded? This is what this is what the sexual revolution was saying in the 70s and 80s and throughout the 90s. And the feminists were right there, chanting along with them that this is liberation. But we all know that it's the opposite of liberation. That once this begins, it's a desire that's never satiated. Pornography addicts maybe start off with benign stuff. They don't end up that way. Just like any other drug, and it is a chemical reaction. It's a very complicated chemical reaction you get addicted to, the endorphins. You get used to it. You build up a resistance to it. So you need harsher and harsher stuff. What they do to these women, one of the reasons I never was into pornography is that I read a lot from the Pink Cross Foundation and other people, former actresses who spoke out what they do to these girls. They torture them. They rip them to pieces. They smile on camera. And you could never see them again. I remember Jenna Jameson in an interview on CNBC one time said, "We hate you. We, the porn stars, the men who are accessing this, we hate you. We hate the fact that you like seeing us this way, that we have to do this stuff to entertain you." We don't say that on camera, but we hate you. Sarah from Rose said that pornography is the devil's iconography. It's interesting to note that all of this is very deeply psychological. They know how to go after men at their most sensitive. What's the most sensitive area of a man's life? And they know exactly how to manipulate that to ruin their self-esteem, unless, of course, you do something like this, selling penis pills and stuff like that. It's a form of brainwashing. I quoted Vaknin's definition of what torture is. This is exactly what this is. The American male went from a relatively inexperienced, innocent guy who rarely ever saw a woman alone, which of course was the case many generations ago, to an animal. And then that was celebrated. Today, it's now criminalized. Doing what the feminists said 20 years ago is okay, now gets you thrown in jail. And I don't believe that's an accident either. This is a way to crush men. This is a way to crush male identity. It's a way to crush any locus of rebellion against them. And of course, it's the ultimate marketing. This is what sells. We all know what sells. And you couldn't do that prior to the sexual revolution, prior to the overthrow of the Legion of Decency, and to completely consolidate Jewish power in Hollywood and make sure the Supreme Court decriminalized all this stuff. Remember, there were no First Amendment cases. The First Amendment issue didn't really matter until this era. 18th, 19th century, very few First Amendment cases. They needed to force the courts to do this. So what the Romanians and the communists did in a very crude way, the West did in a far different, far more gilded cage kind of a way. But I do think that it means that Russians and Ukrainians have Romanians have a very sensitive view towards this stuff. They know exactly what's going on where Westerners don't. When E. Michael Jones did his talk to the Barnes Review back in 2001, he started off by saying, "Do you think it's an accident that the Israeli government beams pornography into the West Bank and Gaza Strip on a regular basis? Why do they do that?" And of course, we know why. That's how you destabilize families. That's how you destroy families. You destroy families, no more rebellion. That's why they beamed it in free of charge, and I think are still doing it.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. So you had mentioned towards the end of your paper how none of this was written about in the English language, that the source material you saw for this was some Russian language and some Romanian language material.
That's changing. That's changing. But yeah, initially, no one in America knows about that. Even specialists in the area don't know about that. But that is changing slowly but surely.
And so why has this aspect of history, why has it been kept so secret?
Because Jews were behind it. You can identify the Jews who were behind it, exactly who they were, where they ended up, why they did it. And it's so overwhelming that they're simply protecting their co-religionists. You would think that this would be a story that would be, documentary making. They love stuff like this, the real lurid stuff, but it's true. You can't make this stuff up. You figure there'd be movies about this and documentaries, but they could make a fortune with this stuff. No. Why? For the same reason they won't talk about the Cossacks and their heroism, because Jews were involved, and protecting them is far more important than anything else.
So do you think that the revolution that ultimately took place in Romania took place as a reaction to or because of all of this?
You mean the torture at the prison?
Yes.
I mean, I'm not saying that there were many, many people there who were reacting to the communist government because of this stuff. It had more to do with Ceausescu's economic policies, Soviet behavior, stuff like that, the CIA operating in Romania. As the communication technology developed, more and more Romanians, especially living abroad, living in this country, having a family living in England and America, were learning about this. Now, Ceausescu was a nasty guy, but he didn't do things like this. So I don't think there was not a direct cause. But, once this is always circulating in samizdat, in underground publications. And the church always, whispered about it. And but I think economics and more mundane things were at the root of it. But this stuff ultimately delegitimized the entire system, whether it be Ceausescu or not. And Romania had one of the more centralized systems of all except for the Albanians. Ceausescu's attempt to regulate fertility, things like that. So there's an indirect connection. To what extent this was known in the late 80s in Romania, I don't know. I decided to do this for a living that very day, Christmas Day, 1989, when they shot Ceausescu after a short trial. That's when I changed my mind. So I was going to do for the rest of my life. That was my watershed moment here. So this is very important to me. And as far as I can tell, it had more to do with economics and the collapse of the Soviet world around them. Remember, Romania was the only bloody counter-revolution. The only time people were shot and there were guns being fired was only Romania. Everywhere else fell relatively peacefully. Romania is the only one that actually had shooting and everything else. And it's possibly because of the nature of this regime, the Securitate and their very specific organization made them very different from the rest of the Warsaw Pact. I don't think there's a direct connection, but I think enough people knew at the time that it didn't help. Everyone knew the regime had no legitimacy, and they would do what they could to bring it down.
So what questions have I not asked that I should have been asking in relation to?
I debate people, almost on a daily basis. And one of my pet peeves is when I talk about something like this, and they say, well, that's not what Marx meant. That's not what socialism meant. And, of course, the response to that is, oh, well, then the U.S. isn't what capitalism is. That's not what it's supposed to be. If it works for you, it could work for me. No, that's not how it works. This is exactly what socialism is. You don't know better than Lenin or Trotsky. They were all exactly the same. They had the same agenda. This is socialism. Socialism had nothing to do with labor, had nothing to do with the working class. It was about recreating humanity. It was a Kabbalistic experiment where they could erase, using purely behaviorist methods, the old loyalties that they considered, primitive, everything that, they hated about the Gentiles, family, nation, state, especially in a place like Romania. They didn't understand what really motivates people. What motivates them is one thing. What motivates a normal person is something else. No, this is socialism. It has nothing to do with labor. No system exploited labor worse than the socialist systems. And they're all the same in this. That can't be a coincidence. No, this is socialism. Karl Marx refused to talk about what the socialist state would look like. He absolutely, there's no political theorist in history that wouldn't describe the kind of idea they want to bring about. Only Marx. He was hiding something. He knew it was going to mean the dictatorship and proletariat, stuff like that. He knew it was going to be nasty. Engels said as much. But he was hiding something. There was an oral tradition, was very, very, Talmudic and Kabbalistic and Marxist sense of what the system was going to be that he wasn't about to write down. There was no theorist in the history of politics that ever just simply refused to explain, well, after the revolution's over, what do we have? I mean, maybe a sentence or two, no more than that, which is very suspicious, to say the least. That's important. This is exactly what he meant. This is about creating new people. It's about using trauma to destroy people's identities and then putting them back together again with materialist ideology at its core. And that means postmodern capitalism and Leninism are the exact same thing. It's the exact same mentality. I don't care if it's privately or publicly owned, it doesn't make any difference. It's still an oligarchy. They still believe in evolution. They still are materialists. They still believe in the Enlightenment and industry and to make the entire world one big factory, as Lenin said, as Ceausescu said. Philosophically, they're exactly the same. They both believe they had the key to history. They're way too similar. And that's the key takeaway here. This is what revolution is. The Tesh prison was what socialism was supposed to be in miniature. I say today that the America of the future is being built on the university campus. That's what they want America to be, the whole country to be. A very tightly controlled, centralized regime with full control over information and your web habits and everything else. That's what happens on college campuses are totalitarian systems run by the left. In the same way, the Tesh prison was supposed to be the country in miniature. This is socialism. There was no riots against it. There was no party, screaming and yelling, we can't have this. No. It was bad. At one point, it looked bad, so they had to stop it. But it wasn't because they were against it. This was what the party demanded. And versions of this, maybe not as extreme, but versions of this existed in every Marxist country. The barrel of a gun. In the West, it's using dollar bills. It doesn't matter. It's the same ideology, the same agenda. And they're going to fail in both cases because there's the spirit, which they don't comprehend. All they know are these natural forces, these sexual or anger or greed. That's all they understand. Free will, which is very hard to achieve, but free will exists, that they don't comprehend. The entire capitalist system is about overthrowing free will and property and creating oligarchy. That's the whole point of marketing. Convince people they need something they don't. This is all the same movement, the same ideology. And I still am struck by the fact that the tortures that they use, the sexual aspects of the tortures that they use in this prison is a normal part of male homosexual life today. And it shows you that it's the same thing, same group of people, same agenda, two very different sets of methods.
Do you think that there's an unseen hand in all of this? And I'm not talking about a mastermind, somewhere up in the Swiss Alps. I'm not talking about George Soros here or whatever. I'm when I say an unseen hand in all of this, I'm talking about maybe a spiritual force, maybe the devil himself.
That there is an evil spiritual force that Lucifer is the foundation of all of this. There's no question in my mind. This is his time to be let loose for a short period of time to winnow down the church to its most faithful members. You see that in the Apocalypse of Isaiah, Apocalypse of Daniel, as well as in the New Testament. This is happening with God's God's not doing it, but he certainly has his permission. Demons would love to tell you that they are independent. They're not. When Satan tortured Job, he had to ask God's permission first. And this is, they would love you to believe that they're equals, but they are absolutely not. Even the victory of demons is their eventual destruction. There was a Satanism even in early Marx, his early poetry. Even the anarchists under Bakunin refer to Lucifer all the time. That this is so well organized, that this has been so victorious with not a whole lot of opposition over the years. There's got to be this unseen hand. Wherever you go, the murder of Tsar Nicholas and everything else, you see these rituals that they are referring to unseen powers. They are referring to They call them under different names, of course. But Prometheus is one, Set is another. But Lucifer, claiming to be the light bearer, the bearer of enlightenment, is the ideology of the new Atlantis, as Francis Bacon would say. Satanism is to be found in those at the highest reaches of power today. And Satan demands sacrifice for any benefit he was going to give to you. And he is the master of industry, as Set was in ancient Egypt. So there's absolutely a spiritual and demonic power here, and you kid yourself if there isn't. This isn't just a few nutjob men. No, this is precisely in tune with the apocalypse in scriptures and in church tradition, and no other institution but Christianity talks about this to this extent in such great detail. So there's no question about it.
Well, one of the reasons I asked you the question is because my understanding of Kabbalism, again, my understanding of Kabbalism is very elementary, but as I understand it, it's very Luciferian, and as I understand Masonry, I see it as being very Luciferian as well. And so we've talked about the Kabbalistic connection and all of this. Was there a Masonic connection?
Well, I think these guys have gone beyond the Masonic degrees. The Kabbalah, thinks it's beyond. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, even Crowley had degrees way beyond 33. Lucifer is mentioned by Albert Pike in the 19th degree, where you finally are in 19th degree in Masonry. You finally are revealed that this is who you've been serving all along. They're not kidding around. It's right in Morals and Dogma, where he goes through all the degrees and describes what it is. And the 19th degree is where you learn that the names that we've been, enlightenment and truth and stuff like that we've been using before, this is really who we mean. But until you reach the 19th degree, you don't learn that. Of course, I'll never call him Satan because that's a negative word. It's a bad word. It's the adversary, enemy, destroyer. Lucifer or Prometheus, I guess, are the two most important ones. Masonry is Judaism for Gentiles, and they certainly understand themselves that way. The so-called Star of David, which has no existence prior to the 17th century, is an occult hexagram. So there's a demonic element, there's a Masonic element, but the Masons, they're kind of fuddy-duddies compared to everyone else. They're the foundation, but when you go beyond them, you get stuff like this. It's intimated in Morals and Dogma, but never explicitly stated. The 33 degrees are just your foundation. Beyond that, you have, what we have today. The revelation of the method, as Michael Hoffman always talks about, for the Rosicrucian text in the 17th century, says that eventually we will reduce people to such a state of bestiality that we could tell them that we rule over them, that this is a demonic element that ruling them, and they won't do anything. Once that happens, I think it's already happened, their control is total. And so they make no bones about it. You just have to know where to look. The media is no place to go. Their job is not to tell you the truth. They don't even see their job that way. Their job is to tell you a good story. They will sell papers, whatever it is. You can't do that. People who think they know things by reading papers and watching CNN are hypnotics. You don't know anything. On what grounds do these people have the job to tell you the truth? And what is they're not experts. They're talking heads. So, you have to go to specialized studies and get deep into this stuff. And then, if you know where to go, it all falls together and becomes very, very clear. And then your life is going to suck because you're going to be an outcast, but at least you have your dignity.
And that is all the time that we have for today's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. I'd like to encourage you to go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net. Sign up for my newsletter. We'll send it out to you absolutely free of charge each and every week. And when you do, I will also send you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. Would also like to encourage you to go to the barnesreview.org and just visit the Barnes Review website. A lot of great material up there. And visit the website of our guest as well. Look up Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson in your favorite search engine. and you'll want to read the academic papers that he's posted online. Anyways, we are out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. So from all of us to all of you, God bless. See you next week.